No, but
That's very bad.
we have another Nico recording.
Nico, you have not been recorded.
Yeah, okay. I made notes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So I'm starting. 15 minutes late. Okay. So yeah, I can speed up a bit and try to make up the lost time, but yeah, we have the great Nico Bauer before. So okay, so yeah, this talk again would be about equity and how we integrate equity and justice aspects into the IAMs, but now we'll take a much more within country perspective, right? Because yesterday Mark Decker also presented international aspects, also Nico Bauer. Now we're taking a brief look what happens within countries, because this inequality also matters a lot. So, of course, probably you already know until now it's the fourth day of the summer school that climate policies can very often lead to what we call regressive distributional impacts. So this means that the poor are more severely affected by them compared to the rich. And of course, this is a problem, right? This is a problem, a moral problem, an ethical problem for the society, but also a very practical political problem, because of course, people just do not accept solutions that are not considered just. And so equity, especially as climate policy deepens into our societies and into our economies as year passes, equity becomes more and more important for mitigation action, because there are, of course, different consequences of mitigation action, both within and across regions, as I will present later. There are also negative distributional implications of climate impacts per se. So not only the climate policy, but the climate impacts are very regressive. And also there are differences in the country's historical contributions, right? There are countries that have emitted a lot, and now they're reducing emissions, but of course there are developing countries that they want to, sorry, this still happens. They see the burning of fossils as a form, let's say, to ensure some form of continuous economic development. And of course, as we see the yellow vest process, but also a lot of other protests within the EU. And especially, I think this will now be the major problem for the next year, because we have the ETS2, as you all know. So we all have to pay carbon taxes for our heating systems and our cars in the next 2 years. So expect much more of these protests to come. So we see a lot of these movements, and also equity is also recognized in the Paris Agreement, with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities of countries and actors. So even the Paris Agreement recognizes that we all should act on climate change, but not on the same basis, right? Some of us should act a bit more. So this graph actually shows exactly that. So it's the distribution of emissions. It shows basically GDP per capita and emissions per capita. And as you can imagine, there's a very straight line. There's a clear correlation between the levels of income and the levels of emissions per capita. And this, of course, means that climate change has quite unequal causes and unequal consequences. So in order to build trust and cooperation in international negotiations, we need to ensure that even the poorest of the countries, the ones that are there, so the countries that emit quite a small amount of emissions, have the right to sustainable development on an equal basis to what the developed countries have achieved so far. But as I mentioned before, it's not only the impacts of climate policies, but the impacts of climate change that are also very regressive. So what happened actually is that climate change is a problem, an anthropogenic problem caused by those that have the highest incomes, by the developed countries, basically they emitted gigantons of CO2 in the atmosphere, but their impacts are very unevenly distributed. And you can see there, for instance, I think it's from the World Bank, for instance, Africa or Southeast Asia, etc. These regions are the ones that will be the most vulnerable to climate change. These are the ones that will suffer the most. So care should be taken in order to avoid this from happening, right? Because it's a problem that these countries have not, or they have very small responsibility, let's say, historically for emissions, but on the other hand, they will suffer the most because of this problem. So now talking a bit more about theory and how, for instance, the different forms of justice are integrated into climate policy. So there are different forms of justice, and literature has identified at least 5 of them. The first of them is the distributional justice, which refers to the fact that the distribution of impacts, benefits, trade-offs, etc., changes across groups, changes across regions or income groups. And this form of justice is the one that is actually much more analyzed with the IAMs, because really it can be quantified, right? We have elements, we know, for instance, the income distribution across within countries. We have some elements that we can quantify this impact. The other forms of justice, like procedural, for instance, is the process of climate policy fair and accessible for all? Or corrective justice. So historical injustice exists, how we can correct for them. And all other forms of justice are, let's say, more of a qualitative nature. So it's quite hard until now, at least, to try to integrate them into IAMs and into the mitigation pathways that we develop with our models. But the first one is something that there's really a lot of work going into that. So in the center of that is a sense of equity. And when we talk about equity, we talk equity within people, within places, and within time. So within people, it means that policies should be equitable across social groups, across different income levels, etc. Places, it means that countries, regions, or even municipalities, etc., should not suffer disproportionately from climate policies. And within time, it has to do with the concept of intergenerational equity, right? So we need to ensure that also the generations that come after us should have equal access, let's say, to the natural resources of our planet. So in the form pointing towards what we call intergenerational equity. And of course, there are many principles where we can operationalize equity in our IAMs and our mitigation analysis. I think Mark has mentioned quite a lot of them quite extensively, so I will not go into that. So there are principles like equal per capita emissions, historical responsibility, where developed countries should have much more action, the ability to pay, and also the adjustment costs, etc. And of course, all these different equity principles, if we operationalize them into mitigation strategies, they mean quite different mitigation effort levels across countries. And this one, previous slide, yes, more or less what Mark presents. So going into this slide, which is a very nice overview of all the nice work that Nick also mentioned that has gone into the integration of justice and equity into the IAMs, okay? So initially, we have 3 basic ways to integrate justice. The first to integrate justice in the models. The first is to integrate them in the narratives, in what we call usually in the models exogenous assumptions, like the SSPs that you mentioned before, Nico, or general quality strategies, or the SDGs, etc. So things that are, let's say, in a sense, exogenous to the model, but if we represent them appropriately, then it means that we take into account equity at least as a form of narrative in our scenario analysis. So this is the first way. The second way is the post-processing of results. So we have the results of IAMs, then we do some ex post calculations, trying to combine probably with different data sets, different indicators, etc., in order to increase the level of indicators that we can provide. A good example of that is the risk of hunger indicator that actually Nico presented before, and something is not calculated directly by IAMs, but it's some form of approximation you can calculate. Also other things like income inequality, financial investment needs, welfare, etc. So this is the second main way to integrate justice into the models. The third is actually takes a more, scientific view and needs to develop modeling versions that are actually integrate equity inside the modeling code itself. And this can be done again with some relatively simple ways, like for instance, the regionally differentiated carbon prices or the regionally differentiated WACCs, like the analysis we did with PRISMA, probably he will present later. The effort sharing, but it can also go into the basic model fundamentals. So we can have alternative objective functions like utilitarian versus other forms of welfare functions. Or we can model more heterogeneity of actors. So we can split, for instance, the one household assumption that is commonly there to different households in order to capture how the different income deciles might be impacted by the climate policies. And a lot of other things. I will not go into each one of them, but this can give you a broad overview of works that are actually ongoing. Some of them are more progress than others, but it can point you towards the direction of how, in all the different ways that the scientific community has used to integrate equity and justice into the models. Yeah, and of course, IAMs is, I think we have discussed quite a lot about IAMs, and their typical application is to analyze least cost pathways, as you very correctly, some of you have mentioned before, or analyzing the technology uptake, requirements, mitigation costs, etc. However, of course, equity is also quite important, right? Because we also want, as IAMs become more and more influential in climate policy, the stakeholders and the policymakers tend to ask us a lot more questions about inequality. So how the poorest of the society will be affected, how specific genders might be affected, how the different educational levels might be affected. So we need, as let's say, IAM community, we have historical centered, of course, on cost efficiency and how we represent better the transition process itself. But we should also include fairness aspects, especially now that as the transition deepens, and now we see, for instance, that the transition has become part of everyday life, even for corporations or for financial institutions, for everyone. So this means that we can provide very good information about how the transition will impact the real people of the society, and not just like an abstract number like a GDP, which is an aggregate indicator that people don't usually understand quite a lot. So here's a graph showing all the different dimensions of inequality, or some of them. For instance, gender inequality, age inequality, education, settlements, income inequality, health, race, religion inequality. So there are quite a broad forms of inequalities that are out there in society, in the real world. But how many of them are really captured in the IAMs? So the first row shows how many of them can be captured in scenarios. And here you can see that, especially through the development of the shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios, the famous SSPs, the community has managed at least to integrate some assumptions about inequality, at least for gender, age, education, and income, of course. However, the real endogenization in IAMs, as you can see, it really lags behind. So it's in most of the aspects, of the equity aspects, no IAM has integrated them so far. Most of the effort has concentrated on the income, aspect of inequality. And this is logical because there we have some data that we can work on. So we have data to see how the different deciles behave, what are their consumption patterns, what are their income sources, etc. So this is quite logical to work on that. But all the other aspects are basically ignored. Or there are some small studies for age or health, nothing for gender, as Marina presented yesterday, etc. So understanding that, we need to go into, sorry. Oh, I thought there was another slide. Okay. No, okay. So there's an urgent need to try to improve the representation of equity, understanding all these aspects and how this really influence the political legitimacy of our mitigation strategies. So some ways that we can use in order to improve is, for instance, first, to improve the disaggregation of our models. So have much more country disaggregation, even subnational disaggregation that I will show you why, in order to capture better the specific context of inequality. Not all countries have the same inequality patterns, not all sectors have the same inequality patterns, so this really matters about the inequality assessments. Of course, we're going to use it to improve much more the SSP scenarios that at least provide some form of inequality frameworks like Gini projections. We can also use alternative welfare functions, but this is a bit, only for the models that actually have welfare, like Remind or WITS, for instance. And there's also great use to understand how we can use the so-called redistributive policies, so policies that can take the government the government revenues from carbon pricing and redistribute them in a way to ensure that the households, let's say, do not face any negative equity impacts. Okay, and a bit about the challenges that we face in order to do that. Of course, we all know that most of the IAMs use representative agents, so one agent per sector most probably. So this tends to mask a bit the heterogeneity in the impacts. As we mentioned, until now the main focus is on income, but they neglect a lot of other forms of equity, like gender equity, health equity, etc. The policy assumptions that, at least from most of the studies, are a bit unrealistic, because most of the studies, as mentioned already by Nico, they tend to depend on this very unrealistic assumption of equalizing carbon prices globally. It really is beyond concept. I mean, something that's not even discussed in international negotiations, really, right? So it's really out of the policy space. However, there is some work on that with the differentiated carbon pricing assumptions going towards the correct direction, I think. We should also include the damage functions, based on what Nick also suggested, in order to take a different perspective into the problem, because it's not only climate policy that may have this regressive impact, but climate impacts per se. They will have this, they will impact the vulnerable, the poorest households the most. So this is something that should really try to endogenize in the models. And finally, we should improve how we integrate the social dynamics and also the stakeholder inputs, which is quite important in order to offer more legitimacy to our modeling results. Okay, let's skip that and go to this very important paper of 2018, where the author suggests some strategies on how we can improve equity in the IAMs. So they have suggested some ways forward. Some of them we have already mentioned, like the integration of adaptation and damage loss modules, which is very, very important in order to really take a realistic perspective, right? Because if you do not do nothing, then climate damage will hit you the hardest, right? And this will have tremendous distributional impacts. The downscaling, of course, in order to increase the specificities of the different sectors and the different countries. Link the integrated assessment models with human development models, so what we call here the micro-simulation models. I will tell a few words about that before, because these models can capture a lot the behavior of the individual household. So by linking these two model types, you can have an economy-wide perspective through the IAM, but then disaggregated into millions can be of households with these micro-simulation models. And also we should engage much more the users in scenario framing in order to increase the procedural justice in a sense, right? So we can make the policymakers aware of our equity assumptions that are equity analysis. So in this paper here, we have identified some ways in order to, I don't know how, I hope so well. Anyway, 3 different ways, generic ways to assess the distributional impacts with the models. So the first one, it refers to direct modeling of income distribution, where you basically, you still have a single representative household model. It can be an IAM or it can be another form of model, an energy system or an economic model or whatever. And it gives out the projections, and you just have an income distribution that it's basically the data, and you just combine its impacts with the income distribution data, but without assuming any changes in the income distribution itself, right? It's like an ex post calculation of the impacts, but can provide a very good approximation of the first order impacts of the policies. The second one is what I will present later in the case study, where we start from a single representative households, but we try to disaggregate it into different representative groups. And in order to do that, we use the so-called household survey data, which at the HBS, a lot of that can be found in Eurostat, and also the labor force survey data, again, we used, where this can provide, with this we can split the household based on different characteristics, like income, for instance, or location, or anything else. And with that, we can endogenize the behavior of I don't know, 10 different income categories, and we can have so the distributional impacts for each representative group. And finally, the one that I haven't done myself, but it seems like a very good way forward, is to have this full coupling of an EA model with the so-called microsimulation models that capture the behavior of thousands or millions of households, and including also the feedback loop, which might be also important. So, because right now it's only one way of calculation, right? Now you can also include the feedback loop back into the EA model in order to recalculate the overall GDP impacts, consumption losses, etc., before going back into that. Again, until they go into a convergence, of course. Okay, not go into that. Okay, let's start now. As presented before already, we know about the famous SSPs. And I just want to show that here is the economic convergence rate. And this, for instance, is by publication in 2020, showing, for instance, the year growth rates and the GDP per capita in 2010. And as you can see, in most of the SSP, there is a clear convergence. What Nico presented, with the exception of SSP3 and SSP4, where we see basically here, for instance, that is basically nothing happens. So it's like inequality is frozen to the 2015 levels, which of course is quite bad for inequality. So with this graph, we just show that even when we take the GDP exogenous assumptions in the models, they already integrate some form of equity with them. So it really matters if we take a world of SSP2 or a world of SSP4, which is a very, very unequal world. And now going into what happens now in the real world, and I mentioned that Eurostat, so you can see now some Eurostat statistics showing, for instance, how much is the share of income spent by decile on energy, okay, in the different countries. And what of course we can show is that the picture is really different compared if you are in the decile one, the most rich, let's say, not the poorest, versus decile 10. So you can see, for instance, decile 1, you see a lot of most households, especially in the southeast part of Europe, they spend more than 8 or even 10% of their income just for energy, which is huge. And this points, of course, to the fact that this may cause energy poverty issues, right? Which is something very, very important, at least for the EU. Decile 1, the situation, decile 10, the situation, of course, is not so bad, as you can see. They're still, in some countries, face the issue. So of course, this is an indicator also of the vulnerability, because the households that are already spend quite a lot on energy, like 10% of their annual income, really a lot or even more, these households, of course, are the most vulnerable to any increase of prices or to any introduction of carbon price, because they will face much higher increase in their energy expenditures that they cannot use their income for other purposes. And here there's some indicators on how we can measure income inequality, just for you to take a look. I will not go into all that, but the one that is really important is the Gini coefficient. Probably you have heard of that, I hope, which is, let's say, compares the distribution of income within a country with a uniform distribution that presents equality. So it's the extent to which a country is close to being an equal society, where it has a Gini of 0, versus perfect inequality, which is a Gini of 1. So the higher the Gini, the more unequal is the society. And also the income quintile share, the S20 to S20, S80 to S20, where basically compare the income received by the top 20% of the population versus the income received by the bottom 20% of the population, indicating a bit the gap in the income between these two categories. And you can see the Gini coefficient of European countries. And of course, there are some, European average is around 30, which is relatively okay compared to global standards. There are other economies that have much higher Gini coefficient, like India, for instance, like a lot of African countries. But within the EU, yeah.
I always forget, 0 means total equality or total inequality?
So if you go to 1, it's total inequality. So the highest is total increase in inequality. So you can see that a lot of Eastern countries like Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, etc., they tend to have quite highest inequality compared to countries like yours, the Netherlands, which is doing very good, Belgium, but also Slovenia and Slovakia, for reasons I'm not very familiar with, but it might be. But they're doing a very good job in trying to have both GDP growth and also an equal GDP growth. Now we're going into our first study. So based on all the discussions we have, I have presented so far, we did a study in order to assess the distributional impact of European net zero policies, right? So what happens by income decile if the EU goes towards a net zero pathway. And we have used the Gen 3 model. I don't know if you're familiar with that. No one, good. No, Nico is the only one that knows, and you, okay? Okay, now Gen 3 is like a CG model, it's a computer general equilibrium model, so that integrates a bit all the agents of the economy into a unified framework. It has labor market, capital market represented, and product market represented, endogenous trade, etc. But yeah, in the last years, it's very widely used together with the models of Nico and all the others as part of the IAM community to do such studies. And on top of that, we have developed a bottom-up model where we have tried to separate the one representative household of Gen 3 per country into 10 income deciles, taking the income by source and consumption features of the country of the decile through the user database. And these models, of course, interact a bit with each other with a CG model, the IAM providing the overall economic conditions like prices, demand for labor, etc. And the bottom-up model for households, bringing back the aggregate consumption until they converge. Okay, so this is the methodology framework that we have used for this project, enabling us to have to have both the macroeconomic closure, so ensuring that everything is in an equilibrium, but also having the features of the 10 different income deciles. Okay, and with that, we did 3 scenarios. the current climate policy one, like usually a EU net zero by 2050 scenario, and net zero scenario, but with lump sum transfer to households. Okay, and we did that not so progressively as Nico did, so we just did it with lump sum transfers, meaning that each household takes an equal share of the carbon revenues, okay, on an equal basis. So even the rich take something. Okay, so let's start with the reference scenario, because I hope it's shown properly. Anyway, even the reference scenario, we can see indexes of increased inequality. So as our society evolves, first you can see the graph on the right, that this shows the composition of European labor value added by skill. Okay, so and these skill levels are taken by the GTAP database, which is the most widely used economic database of the world. And it decomposes skills into different levels, like low skilled service workers, technicians, clerks, managers. And what is shown there is actually that we have a very slight move towards more the low skilled, the share of low skilled decreases. Okay, so high skills become more and more important because of the digitization, of the automation of the economy, and everything all jobs require a bit more skills than the current. But this is a form of inequality, right? Because not everyone has access, for instance, to a proper university or a master's degree in order to get to the managerial or other high-level works. Okay, and this is also shown in the Gini coefficient. I hope you can see this. The uncertainty captures the 28 member states of the EU plus the UK, the 27 members plus the UK. So it really shows that Gini increases by 1.8 points by 2050. Okay, so in the reference scenario, business as usual case, inequality increases in the EU by 2 percentage points. Also shown that the desired dispersion index also increases along the same lines. And then what happens when we go to the net zero? First, we see that there are changes in the composition of European labor, again towards higher skills. So as the transition deepens, it means that the economy will face not a very structural, because we see the percentage increase are not that high, but in any case, we see that jobs, for instance, related to coal mining jobs, etc., which really require relatively low skills, they're going to vanish. And let's say the jobs related to the energy transition will become a bit more, but these jobs require higher skills, right? So this means that we move again towards higher skills. And of course, on the level of the economy, we, as a CG model, we see that the net zero, of course, will have some mitigation costs, as present in all the various studies before, due to increases in energy prices and the reduced investment. But this decomposes the changes in income by decile, okay, for 2030, 2040, 2050, and for the different deciles. And let's go to 2050, for instance, what we saw is that the highest impacts are even felt for the poorest of households, okay? So the ones that live, they are D1 to 23, they face an income loss of about 2%, while, the others face a loss of about 1%, which is, of course, a lot lower, around half of the mitigation costs. So this again points to the fact that the transition can be regressive if it is based on a unified carbon price. Sorry, Nico. Sure.
Technical issues. So, is this income change also taken into account price changes?
Yeah.
Of energy and food?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it's to say the real income effect. Okay.
Correct. Because part of that is again due to increasing energy prices and food prices, which means that the households with the same amount of money have access to lower amount of goods. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's a very good question, but we haven't. In theory, it can, although it depends, of course, on which scenario you're looking into. I mean, if you're looking into a scenario that the whole world goes into a Paris-compatible scenario, I would assume we will face more or less a similar picture as that everywhere, because it's the demand that pushes so hard for higher skilled workers, right, in order to enable the transition. But if what you suggest probably will happen in a scenario that the EU acts alone, so you can see the migration effects, etc.
I could imagine different transitions.
Mm-hmm.
How does the transition towards a zero emission society really looks like? And I could imagine a transition where you have to rebuild a lot of infrastructure, including housing and insulation. You have more public transport, bus drivers.
Mm-hmm.
So I could imagine a transition where the demand for low-skilled workers can also increase.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the storyline behind the transition that we are seeing here? Is this one where everything gets, let's say, more efficient by more efficient use, or do you also rebuild and demand more low-skilled labors?
Yeah, of course. The transition can have, as you very correctly say, very different phases. And this is why I mentioned that the changes are not so high in any case. We're talking something like 0.2%. Of the labor force, right? It's not huge. It's not huge. But what we know in this scenario, we have done other scenarios with more, for instance, lifestyle changes like public transport, etc. But no, here it's like a cost-efficient scenario towards net zero. So basically, the economy transforms in the best possible way in order to ensure the net zero. And this happens, I said, mostly due to coal miners, basically, which are considered relatively low skilled, with serious issues on how this can be reskilled and getting back, well, I don't know, other business. Okay, so are we here? Yes. Okay, and here again is a very nice indication of the very high distributional impacts across deciles. So the first graph here shows the energy expenditure indicator as a share of income across member states. So the D1 is the poorest across all European member states, and can show a median of 21%. So the households spend there on average 21% of their income only for energy purposes, and this can go up to 50% for the poorest countries, something like Bulgaria or potentially Greece. I don't know. Okay, and of course this. As we move towards the highest income levels, if you go there, the richest part of the society spends something between 1% and 5% only for energy, despite consuming so much more energy than the poorest half of the society, right? Because their income is so much higher that it really makes up for the difference. So this happens, let's say, in the reference scenario, the business as usual. But what we actually also show here is that the changes that we see in the net zero scenario are also regressive, because the impact, this is the net change of share, right? The impact is felt much more for the poorest households, the D1, like an increase of average 2%, compared to the highest incomes in the society, 0.3, basically nothing for them, okay? All these points to the actual, this is what, for instance, people tend to impose all this carbon pricing, energy taxation, and all these things, because they do not understand, they understand that the poorest will be much more heavily impacted compared to the richest if we do not do any redistributive policies, which is, where I go now. Because until now, we have focused only on what happens, for instance, if the government takes the revenue, it just uses for public budget purposes, right? But what can happen if the government takes the carbon revenues and gives it back to households as lump sum transfer? So here we can see completely different picture. Completely different. I mean, this can be translated into higher income for all deciles, but especially the low income ones. And this is why they receive, as I said, all households receive the same amounts. But if you give 1,000 to the poor, really makes an increase in their as a share of their income. If you give 1,000 to, I don't know, to the Tesla owner, probably it will be nothing for him. Okay, so this is why you see very, very clearly that the highest impact, positive impact now is felt for the low-income decile. So, and again, this is also shown in the Gini coefficient, right? Where now it declines by 1.3, but it can decline by up to 4 percentage points in some European member states. So this shows, let's say that the EU can achieve decarbonization and improve societal equity, but it will need well-targeted compensatory policies. And we need transparency on how these extra government revenues are then redistributed back to the people. And if the people will understand that, I'm totally sure that they will be okay for this transition. They will be very much supportive of this transition. So it really matters. And this is actually the main idea also of the social climate fund, right? Because this is exactly what will be done in the EU in the next 2 years. At least a large part of these revenues will be given back to the households. So moving forwards from this study, and then we want to test if these results are robust to different models for different countries. So we use now 4 leading macroeconomic models. One of them is GEMI3, the other 3 are models that participated in the Navigate and the PRISMA project. And there again, we compare 2 revenue recycling schemes. The one is the lump sum transfers, and the other one is to reduce the labor taxes, essentially subsidizing labor. Here we can see the movements in the Gini coefficient and for the different models and the different scenarios. Overall, the picture looks good because in by far the most of the scenarios and models, we see improvements in the Gini coefficient, which means inequality, equity improves, okay? If we do this redistributive policy through lump sum transfers. And the impact, of course, will be felt much higher for China and India, because these two countries have the largest carbon revenues as a share of their GDP, because we impose them a universal carbon pricing. So the governments tend to get very high amounts of revenue so that they can use to reduce even by up to 20 or 30 percentage points. This really makes a difference, right? Because Gini coefficient now they can be, I don't know, 45 or 50. If you reduce by 20 points, it can go down to European standard or even better. This really can be life-changing. If all these are redistributed transparently, which is something that's not taken for granted, right? It's very difficult usually with the governments. We all know that. It's very, very difficult. Yeah, so.
I think you implement this with all the countries.
How we implement that? Oh, the 4 models, they are global. Yeah. So they have the similar coverage of countries. So these Brazil, China, India, EU, and USA. So all these countries representing all the 4 models, right? And then we use exactly the same assumptions in the 4 models, right? So we impose a net zero scenario. We took the carbon revenues, we redistributed it within the countries without any transfers between the countries, okay? As lump sum transfers, and we got these results. So yeah.
But all these models already have like household income.
Yeah. All these models use a relatively similar way to represent these 10 income deciles that actually came from the Navigate project, where we have CMCC actually developed this database with a lot of data that you can find, which is accessible to all, for income deciles and how consumption and income is split in the different countries by decile. So we use similar data to do that. Yeah. Good. So, how much time?
Just wondering how many slides there.
I will go fast. I will go fast. Okay. So another part that we haven't touched so far is the distributional impacts now within sectors, so within production activities, right? And there, our analysis showed again that there will be clear winners and clear losers from the transition, right? On the winning side, of course, we have electricity supply, because electrification is a very important part of the decarbonization process. So, and also renewables, workers in the renewables will massively increase. Construction is another important winner because of all the infrastructure that needs to be built in order to support the transition, like insulation of buildings, like grid infrastructure, whatever. Also, the manufacturing for renewable goods will also see a lot of gains because, yeah, you also need someone to manufacture the PV, the EVs, the wind turbines, etc. On the loser categories, yeah, all of them are a bit expected. So everything that has to do with coal, oil, and gas, for extraction, distribution, refineries, air transport, like aviation, but also the energy-intensive industries, right? Because especially these industries are very much prone to high energy costs because they use a lot of energy, they emit a lot of CO2. So when we impose a CO2 price on them, they will face very high production cost increase, and this, of course, will reduce the demand. And this is something that now the EU tries a bit to reconcile, right? With all this compass competitiveness issue, they try to find the middle space between decarbonization and competitiveness. Because especially this sector also employs quite a lot in countries, especially countries like Germany and or others in the EU. So yeah, if this sector loses, it means, let's say, we'll face high societal concerns. And there are also sectors where the outcome is not quite clear, like the services sector, which is not directly impacted by decarbonization. Agriculture might be on the positive side of things, especially if we have a lot of biofuels, and also other industries, the non-so energy-intensive ones. And we also go again to the regional disparities, like what Nico presented a bit before, again using some 3 models now to show the GDP impacts of the 1.5 scenario with common carbon pricing. And we see there are major losers like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, unfortunately also India. But this has to do with the fact that this scenario is very unrealistic. So it assumes common carbon pricing globally. And we found out that the major determinants of these results are the carbon intensity of GDP. So economies that start from a very high level of carbon intensity per unit of GDP, they tend to face the higher costs, like China or India. The role in fossil fuel trade. So economies like Russia or Saudi Arabia that export a lot of fossils, of course, they will face export losses due to the restructuring. The structure of the economy, so countries like the EU or maybe Japan, where we are already quite efficient in the production processes and quite renewable heavy, they will face relatively small costs. Okay, so this is, let's say, another form of disparity or distributional impact that we face. Sorry. Across models, yes.
You don't have to.
What would you say, Nico? It's quite strange. Yeah, I agree, but probably refer to that one, right? This might be a bit.
Imagine it is always the question, what other policies they impose along with the climate policy, because a lot works through the public budget and how that is redistributed then. And I could imagine that there is also a price reform, that has a positive a fuel price reform in Saudi Arabia that can have a positive impact. And that would be a baseline improvement. So they should do this anyways. And then it is not related to the climate policy as such, but it is, they usually impose policy packages, and these IAM model with India, that could be that they.
No, we know the reason, but
policy also.
no, it's another reason. But should we go into that? Do we have the time?
No.
It has to do with how macroeconometric models behave versus CG. They have a different economic theory in their frameworks, right? So this is why you see that, and also that, all positive, okay?
Usually this is related to some expansion of credit.
Exactly, that can be done for free.
Boosts growth but this is also a kind of a baseline effect that may happen anyways with or without climate.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, let's move close that. Okay, and I think this is one of the last things. The multimodal paper we did last year, again, focusing on inequality and climate change. So here you can see the Gini index, okay? Different models, different scenarios. 2030, 2050, 2100. And we start with the effect of no climate policy. So we use dates leading IAMs to assess this distributional impact. So when we say no climate policy, it means that we only have climate damage, right? And what we saw here is that with climate damages alone, inequalities increased by 1.4 points of the Gini index on average globally. Of course, this can hide very important differences and very large differences across regions. The Paris Agreement scenario reduces the Gini index to 0.4 only, so it's very good also for equity, but it increases slightly in the short term, you see, but not so much. And finally, we have the Paris Agreement with equal per capita distribution, like lump sum transfers, like we did in the other study, which, as we say, we can offset all these negative equity effects, and we can lower the Gini index a lot. So again, the study provides very robust results. It's also published in Nature Climate Change, but we use 8 very different models and different methodologies, different assumptions, etc., and they provide very robust assumptions of the effect of these redistributive policies. Yeah, and about the welfare impacts of this scenario, we saw that again, when we have no climate policy, so we only face climate damages, welfare reduced by 7 points, which is huge, towards the end of the century. This has to do with reduced economic growth due to damages, but also increased inequality. Then, in the Paris scenario, we still have some policy costs, but we saw that welfare losses they stabilize around 5%, which is, again, much better than the scenario only with damages. And if we do also the compensatory transfers to households, we see exactly the opposite trends. We see even welfare increasing in the short term and having minimal effects on the long term. So again, pointing to the fact that with this policy, you can ensure welfare gains for, yeah, so that's it.
We really have to wrap up.
Yes, okay, let's.
We need to be back here in time, and it's 11:30. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, next slide. So integrating equity into the IAMs, I think it's not optional, at least in the phase that we are. It's like an imperative. It's ethically and politically fundamental. As in the next round of the transition, I think everyone will look for results for specific countries, specific sector, specific households. Okay, and we saw that there are a lot of works in this area, different methods, different models, different approaches, but with these enhanced models, we can yield more robust and just mitigation pathways. We can strengthen the public trust into climate policy, which for me is the single most important thing that we should do in the next decade, to ensure that everyone is on board and we have a just transition, that no one is left behind and really is part of the transition, and also with align with fairness commitments. So that's it from my side.
Probably honest. I think great presentation that sort of linked lots of the concepts we discussed before and made, for me at least, lots of things clearer. It seems like you guys are doing everything all the time. But okay. Yeah, so like I said, we really need to be here again at 11:30 because for lunch, we need to be there at 12:30, and I want Bjarne to have like a proper podium as well. So that means, I mean, I would say like have one or two very pressing picture.
It's really
Uh,
present.
And then we can just discuss further, right? So go for it.
Yeah, you kind of talked about equity in these three dimensions, people, places, and time. We're getting time. How can you reconcile the people and place? And thinking maybe also your question, the EU case, for example, where you have a rich entity that is supposed to be transferring funds to less rich regions for them to develop and the carbon budget to make sense. But at the same time, because the EU has to do this internally, right? They have to be like transfers internally, but also internationally. So how can you reconcile both, given that like monetary budgets?
Yeah, very good question, actually. Very good. So should we take anything else before?
Sorry?
Should we take another one or?
Only if there's a very important other one. I don't see
No,
it,
but
so let's keep it.
I need some time to think. No. Okay. No, the question is very important because yeah, it's exactly as you said. So because we all have these different distributional impact or equity issues, different places, different people, etc., that affects everything. So this needs to be transferred of how we can reconcile all the different priorities, right? All these, for me, are different policy priorities. And I think now we are in this state, at least in the EU, because with the discussion is much more progressed, that the Commission needs evidence about that. Needs evidence about how we can, for instance, split the amount of carbon budget revenues that we have or the carbon pricing revenues that we have into different income classes or member states or sectors even, because we should ensure that we have a competitive transition for the industries, but on the other hand, a very just transition for the people, etc. So I do not have a definite answer. I know that all these are part of the problem and should be in the picture. So what we try to do is to evaluate all of this separately and try now to integrate everything back in, trying to see the better ways, the most, I don't know, well-being, better improvising ways in order to address all these equity aspects. And I think this is also where the policy discussion is going, because now the Commission has decided basically on how they can split the social climate fund, but this is not an ongoing discussion. So scientists and NIA modelers specifically, we can address that. We can reach out with our studies and our analyses, and we can make a real impact, I think, on this side, especially now, before 2027, where it's all decided.
Okay, thanks again. Yeah, so let's meet again here at 11:30, and the weather is okay, so I'm going outside. So there's actually a glass here. I don't know if this belongs to anybody.
Glasses.
Profound. But maybe.
And I also change the first name.
It's good to mention it because I need to kill this.
We can also do it before we start. I think if it's HDMI, then
It's whatever you want. So there's more options.